Hello, everybody. Um, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our early history of children's literature document. If you weren't in class last time, it's in our first unit. And you want to print it out, you can, but it's about 40 pages. So I will also give you a copy on Thursday, although you should have actually read up to page 62. I think it's 62. And we talked about a little bit of this last time, but one thing I want to mention is that I read all of your posts regarding this part of the document, which, as you know, the first test is based on this document. They were really good understanding of some of the things that were being debated and some definitions of children's literature, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just point out that defining children's literature is similar to defining literature. So that's my take on it, although there's a lot of different conflicting ideas of this, especially early on when a lot of our authors and critics in this document talked about children's literature. All right, so if I'm talking about literature with a capital L, what am I defining that as? Am I defining it as something that's written down anywhere? Like I think I've mentioned to you, is it something that if I go to the doctor's office and I want to find out about skin cancer and the doctor says, on that wall, we have a lot of literature about skin cancer. Well, that's something written down. That's probably good information. But when we're talking about literature, obviously in a literature course, we're talking about writings that have been chosen by critics, scholars, other authors over time as being the best quality of reading materials for in a particular genre or for whatever group, usually adults, but in this class, obviously we're talking about children's literature too, but children don't put these books into the canon, C-A-N-O-N, themselves. That means the group of texts that's widely considered the best writing there is. They contribute to it because they aren't going to read or continue to listen to writings that they don't like. So they do contribute to the idea of what's good, but obviously, or what's considered quality, but obviously adults compile these lists. And over time, early on, literature was considered the canon, the Western canon I'm talking about really, was chosen by men, scholars, and so contained mostly men, white men. And so even if you look at our textbooks, our anthologies today, you'll see that although we have evolved over time, thankfully, and we have people from different cultures and genders and et cetera included in the canon, it's still mostly full of white men, although it's evolving. All right, so if I'm talking about literature, I have to define what's good about it, what makes it, does it have depth, does it remain important over time, is it referenced as being an important piece of writing for other authors, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to read something. And also, okay, this was, all right, Terry Eagleton, he says, in the 18th century England, the concept of literature was not confined, as it sometimes is today, to creative or imaginative writing. It meant the whole body of valued writing in society, philosophy, history, essays, and letters, as well as poems. Well, literature, poems are literature too, in my opinion. What made a text literary was not whether it was fictional. The 18th century was in grave doubt about whether the new upstart form of the novel was literature at all. They didn't consider it to be literature necessarily, and maybe it was just frivolous. But whether it conformed to certain standards of polite letters. All right. Let's see. And a lot of you talked about Harvey Darton, who wrote in 1932 children's books in England, and he talked about how children's literature should be limited to books specifically produced for children and designed to give them pleasure rather than to instruct. Well, if we look at children's literature now and literature over time, we can realize that almost all children's literature written specifically for children, almost all of it teaches a lesson or has a moral or shows a hero or shows someone being kind to someone else, or it does teach them something. Adults who write for children do usually choose to write things which they consider healthy and moral for children. There are things which are not, but those aren't necessarily, we don't read a lot of kindergartners or let kindergartners watch South Park as much. All right, so, okay, then let's see. Who said this? Gene Watson said, so other people talked about this, a literary work becomes a children's book when a child finds pleasure in it. So, okay, they are considering the fact that children help to define what a work of children's literature is. Let me see. Let's see. Sorry. Another argument is that children's literature doesn't belong to children, it belongs to adults, because adults decide what they want their children to know about, to learn about, to think is funny, to think is interesting. And that's usually based on the experiences that the adult writer has as a child or is interested, him or herself. Skip. All right, we'll talk about genres for a second. Children's literature, is it a genre or isn't it a genre? Well, it's a category, I would say. So, and this is Nodelman, I think he says fantasy, let's see, genres can be categorized as fantasy, realism, or, yes. A literary genre is a category of literature such as adventure, fiction, or mysteries. Then when you have a piece of children's literature, it can be categorized into specific genres, which are part of children's literature. All right, we talked about, or you read about John Newbery, the godfather of the person who invented children's literature. Well, that's not exactly true, but we have to give someone some credit. And we do have the Newbery Award now, which is a coveted award every year given to the best books written for children. The difference between what he did, and other people were doing it too, it was just him, he was singled out, was have a book that was just for children. It was not really, it was written only for children. It wasn't written for adults. And it also included a toy, which is like, if you ever bought cereal and there was a toy in it, that was always a selling point. I'll show you the book tomorrow and you can decide to yourself, or not tomorrow, Thursday, you can decide to yourself if you think it's a lot of fun to read for children. Okay. Yes, the book was called A Little Pretty Pocketbook, which already in this day and age, I kind of think, gee, I don't want to read that book. That doesn't sound like much fun at all. But apparently it was fun then, just had less fun. All right. Let me see. Sarah Fielding and her husband were two religious and authors who wrote a book called, let me see. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm making a mistake. Okay, I'm making a mistake. Sarah Fielding wrote the first novel for children. A novel should usually have a introduction, a rising action, some kind of climax, and then the denouement, something where there's fallout. And reading that novel, it's sort of patched together. And yes, I guess it could be considered a novel, but it's not really a novel the way we think of novels today. However, it was the first book for children that was a full-length whole book that was about pretty much one thing. So that was in 1749. All right. But before the 18th century, I want to point this out, and I have talked about this before, general audience and, writings for children consisted of general audience and crossover texts, those written for everyone, both adults and children, or those written for adults, but appropriated by children, meaning children went, oh, I want to read that, or I'm going to look at the pictures or whatever. Educational books, textbooks, primers, conduct manuals, including religious texts, catechisms, books of martyrs, children's Bibles, and religious instructions, and didactic poetry and stories, which are imaginative works whose primary purpose is to teach a specific lesson. We talked a lot about Aesop's fables and how they became crossover works. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but we're going to talk about fairy tales a lot on next time. Then there were chapbooks, which were written in the 16th century and had wonderful stories like The Babes in the Woods. The Babes in the Wood. Let me read to you a little bit from The Babes in the Wood, which was written sometimes in the middle 1500s or 16th century. Their pretty lips with blackberries were all besmeared and dyed, and when the shades of night arose, they sat them down and cried. Oh, I forgot to tell you, their uncle threw them out of the house. And well, what he does is he gets an inheritance. He gets his friends to go, or friends, two ruffians, he calls them, to take the kids out and sort of leave them in the woods. All right. But one of them takes pity on him, murders his fellow thug, and then he abandons the children in the woods because they were supposed to kill them. That's right. All right. Their pretty lips with blackberries were all besmeared and dyed, and when the shades of night arose, they sat them down and cried. These pretty babes thus wandered long without the least relief, the woods, the briars and thorns among, till death did end their grief. So they died. And then at the end of the book, there's actually, of the story, there's a warning for parents, sort of like a cautionary tale. Ye guardians, warning take hereby, and never prove ingrate. To helpless infants still be kind, and give to each his right. For if you do not, soon you'll find God will your deeds requite. So there's a lot of danger and death in early children's literature. Some of the fairy tales can be quite grisly, which we will examine later. All right, and then of course there were adult classics like Robinson Crusoe and other books that were adventures that children got interested in because they were fun. It's like this were fun. Oh, here's what I was going to tell you about, and this has to do with Maria Edgeworth and her husband, who wrote Practical Education in 1798, and this is when it started. People started to worry. People worried for a long time about what was right, what was wrong for children and other people. They figured that reading a lot of children's literature would make children not pay attention and do their work, kind of like video games or television or one of those things. It's always something. All right, here's what she says. With respect to sentimental stories and books of mere entertainment, we must remark that they should be sparingly used, especially in the education of girls. This species of reading cultivates what is called the heart prematurely, lowers the tone of the mind, and induces indifference for these common pleasures and occupations which, however trivial in themselves, constitute the far greatest portion of our daily happiness. So it says they're going to pay attention to this. They're going to get all caught up in adventure and love stories, and they're going to forget to do what they're supposed to be doing, and they're not going to pay attention. Stories are the novels of childhood. We know from common experience the effects which are produced upon the female mind by immoderate novel reading. To those who acquire this taste, every object becomes disgusting, which is not in an attitude for poetic painting. A species of moral picturesque is sought for in every scene of life, and this is not always compatible with sound sense or simple reality. So cannot pay attention to this reading stuff because too much, and you should only let girls read a little bit because they'll forget themselves. And then as far as the advice for boys, she says, although they thought these and other sentimental stories were particularly dangerous to girls, they considered tales of adventure especially bad for boys, because the taste for adventure is absolutely incompatible with the sober perseverance necessary to success. The Edgeworths even criticized castaway novels such as Robinson Crusoe and its imitations. In effect, pleasurable works were condemned in favor of religious and instructional ones. You don't want these boys getting too excited by adventure and running off when they should be working around the house or outside. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say now about those first few pages of the early history of children's literature, and I will talk to you very soon. Thank you.